So, something that I have been really seeing the more that I study and look into a lot of the deep aspects of biblical history and really, really deeply, not just into scriptural narrative, but also going really deeply into when you start looking into what the words of the original languages are attempting to convey with the passages that we read in English, and you look deeply into what the original meanings of these languages like Hebrew actually meant. The meanings are always so much deeper than what you read at face value in the English translation of scriptures. I am 100% confident now in saying, without any doubt, that what you read in the English version of scriptures, you're reading one story, which is the surface, the face value story. And then there's the much deeper meanings. Then there are the narratives that the scriptures are tending to convey in the original languages, Hebrew especially, that most people who never look into the source languages never understand. Literally, there are entire belief systems, there are entire doctrines that if you read and you look into the original languages of the scriptures, you look into the original meanings of especially what biblical Hebrew was attempting to convey, you are going to come away with such a deeper understanding of what Father was preserving for his children to understand. And you're also going to see, with no doubt, that so much about what people think they understand about the scriptures when they read their Bibles, even the assumptions they have about why things happened, is completely wrong. I mean, just more so than anybody can imagine. I mean, they're just wrong. I have been seeing more than ever how important it really is when, if you decide that you're going to read the scriptures, you have got to become a student of the scriptures. You have to start looking into and studying all kinds of stuff. You have to start truth seeking in every single avenue that you can find, because there is so much knowledge, there is so much more that the scriptures can convey if you look into and understand what the scriptures originally meant in the tongue that they were penned in. You strip the Hebrew away, you strip even the Greek away, but especially you strip the Hebrew away, you come away with such a watered down, bastardized form of the scriptures, it's not even funny. It's not to say that there's nothing that remains the same and everything is just completely and totally wrong and totally twisted. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, if you don't have an understanding of the Hebrew, the biblical Hebrew, if you don't look into especially what certain words were translated into from the biblical Hebrew into English, if you don't understand that, then, and you just go by the English, that is literally why so much of the Christian world has gone so far astray, is because they're getting their doctrines and they're taking their understanding from a version, a language style of the scriptures that doesn't even properly convey what they were originally meant to convey. And I've heard people say things before like, well, yeah, but I mean, don't you think that, and this, of course, they'll use the pagan word, they'll say, don't you think that God is mighty enough to make sure that the exact same meaning remains the same in English? No, because every language is different. At its base, logically speaking, every language is different. English literally cannot, it is impossible for English to properly convey everything down to the exact spirit, the exact nature of what the Hebrew scriptures were themselves conveying. It is impossible. It is literally a grammatical impossibility for English to properly convey everything that the Hebrew scriptures conveyed, or even the Greek, in their original tongues. It's not, has nothing to do with Father not being mighty enough. It's the limitation of grammar. It's the limitation of the languages themselves. You can't change the fact that there are Hebrew words, that one Hebrew word will literally have 2 to 3 completely different meanings, unlike an English word, which has one definition and one meaning. Hebrew is so much deeper. It's a different language. You can't bridge that gap. It's just a linguistic fact, it's a grammatical fact that there are words and meanings of words in Hebrew that does not exist in English and vice versa. To say that, well, that means that we don't serve a very mighty almighty, then that's a cop out. It has nothing to do with Father's power. It has everything to do with human limitations, with the limitation of the human language. And therefore, why do you think this yet again shows, why do you think that it was written for us in Thessalonica Aleph, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, that we are to test all things, to hold fast and approve that which is good? What does testing mean? By the English definition, okay, testing, the way we will understand it, for your benefit, testing literally means to examine, to understand, to look into, to put something under the proverbial microscope and look at it deeply. Not just to gloss over it, but to study it and examine it from every angle, to test it. And that includes languages. That includes, if we are told to test all things, then we are being told that encompasses everything. That even includes languages. That even includes the languages of Scripture. That includes Scripture itself. Everything that we do, we are to test. So to say, well, if I have to look into the original languages of Scripture because my English Bible falls short and doesn't convey the proper meaning, well, my Almighty isn't very almighty then to keep the meaning the exact same regardless of language. You're literally using that as a cop-out. You're using that as an excuse, because that argument directly contradicts what we are explicitly told to do, to test all things. So if you say that, you are contradicting. You are literally making an excuse from what you were commanded to do. That's a fact. I get that there's some people that are not very studious. Typically speaking, I'm not a studious person. I'm not very academic. I hated school growing up. Most subjects I had no interest in. However, I am very interested in anything to do with faith and with Father. So for me, scriptures, studying biblical history, studying the meaning of words in Hebrew and Greek and how they were translated into English, I love that. To me, it's very interesting. I myself would love to speak fluent biblical Hebrew, not modern Hebrew, that's based on Ashkenazi, with the square script. I would love to learn how to speak the actual proper Paleo biblical Hebrew and understand and be able to write the Paleo Hebrew script. That would just be amazing. So yeah, I love it. It's very interesting to me. I know some people, they don't feel that way, but as a child of Yah, the most important thing we can give him is our dedication and our adoration and our commitment to our faith. That is the most important thing we can give him. Period. End of story. So if that means that when we are reading the scriptures, we need to look into where they came from, we need to look into what tongue was this scripture originally penned in, Hebrew or Greek. And we need to take it upon ourselves, especially with certain places in scripture, certain passages, certain books, certain chapters. If you do not understand the Hebrew context of certain of these passages in these places in their original language, you are literally going to completely misunderstand and misinterpret. Completely. Totally. What you're reading. And that's a fact. I mean, for instance, and I'm not proclaiming any side here. So I'm not saying I'm a gap theorist. I'm not advocating either position. My own position is much different, but it's no different than looking into the original Hebrew in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, verses 1, verse 2. Most people who read Genesis, they don't even think about it, and this causes a huge or this is what has caused a huge theological issue with Genesis, especially for secular individuals, people who have a hard time reconciling the creationist theory of the world being a few thousand years old and the evolutionist geological theory of the world being billions of years old, and according to the fossil record and geologic time framing and mapping. But most people, almost every Christian, ever reads the Bible, they read through Genesis 1 verse 1 verse 1 and 1 verse 2. They read those two verses and they just blow past it. But most people don't even stop to consider, if you don't understand the Hebrew, what the original Hebrew of Bereshith, of Genesis, was conveying and what it actually meant, then you're going to miss how in Genesis 1:1, where it says, in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. And then verse 2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was hovering over the face of the deep. Well, let's just focus on verse 2, that the earth was without form and void. And most people, in fact, I'm going to say probably 90% of Christians who read their Bibles never stop to consider this. And again, I'm not saying I'm a gap theorist. For anybody who's watching this and knows what I'm about to say or is following along, I'm not saying I'm a gap theorist. Again, I'm very different on my belief on the narrative of Bereshith Genesis completely. I'm not a proponent of the symbolic metaphorical interpretation of the creation narrative in Bereshith Genesis, and I'm also not a gap theorist. But I'm just saying, most people who never look into the original languages and never look into the Hebrew, they don't understand the nuances of the Hebrew words and how they were translated into English, and how the English translation of Bereshith of Genesis, verse 1 and verse 2, how it's written and what it fails to convey. Most people, when they read verse 1, in the beginning Elohim created the heavens and the earth, and then verse 2, and the earth was without form and void, and most people literally don't think. Just stop for a minute. Okay, so in verse 1 of Bereshith of Genesis, in the beginning Elohim created the heavens and the earth. And then verse 2, the earth was without form and void. Well, most Christians, when they read that, they just think, oh, well, in the beginning he created, and the earth was without form and void. Okay, well, most people don't even, it's almost like your mind just skips over this and you rationalize it in your head without really thinking about what you're rationalizing. But for one thing, if the Bereshith Genesis creation narrative was actually conveying creation from like the very, very beginning, then you would immediately stop it. Well, okay, wait a minute. If verse 2 picks up in verse 1, the earth was without form and void, and the earth was without form and void, and he just created. Well, wait a minute. If it said he just created, then shouldn't that kind of be worded like how the earth had just been made? But why does it say in verse 2 that and the earth was without form and void? That very clearly shows you that the planet was already here, which immediately interrupts that entire Bereshith Genesis narrative of the 6 days of creation being the original creation. Right there's a problem. But an even deeper theological issue is, especially, and we might actually look into this one day, so I'm not going to go super deep into the Hebrew right now, but especially when you look into the original Hebrew of Bereshith Genesis verses 1 and 2, in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. So for Father to create something, okay, he created the heavens and he created, let's just say, just focusing this material physical planet. Well, if he created these things, when they're newly created, how does it make sense that in verse 2 it says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep? Well, if you think about it, also from just the perspective of understanding just basic astronomy, a planet, when it is created, okay, it's part of a solar system. The Father creates light sources, like the sun, that shines and gives light on things. So just from just the cosmological perspective, How could a planet that exists, it's just been created, and it's in the same solar system, the same sphere as the sun, which gives light. The verse says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So the waters, and there's darkness. Automatically, most people are going to think, wait a minute. Well, if there's sunlight, there's light from the expanse, the space. Why was the earth dark? Why was there darkness? And people are automatically going to think, okay, so the earth was without form and void. So the planet was already here. It was without form and void. So meaning there was no structures, no mountains, no geographic shapes yet. It was just water. So without form and void. No life, no nothing. But there's a planet here. There's water here. And it's dark. People are automatically going to make the assumption, all right, well, that automatically doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, the Bereshith Genesis is supposed to be the original creation narrative, and we're being told that in the beginning he made the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, and the earth was without form and void. Darkness over the face of the deep. Well, what? That just don't make a lot of sense. I mean, if he just made everything, you would think that it'd be written that the planet would be being described as, and he placed this body together and it was newly formed. But in verse 2, it talks about the earth very clearly like it was already here by the time the Bereshith Genesis creation narrative starts out. And then the days of creation after that. People are automatically going to stop and have questions. And then when you start looking into the original Hebrew of Bereshith of Genesis, just verses 1 and 2, then you start understanding different interpretive doors start being opened. Then you start getting into things like the gap theory. And again, we might talk about this someday in depth. The only thing I'll say right now is the gap theory is basically, it is a theological belief that some people get from reading the original biblical Hebrew of Bereshith, Genesis, verses 1 and 2. Specifically, it really comes down to like two main Hebrew words. And essentially, it's a belief that verse 1, in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. Between verse 1 and verse 2, within the historical time period, that verse 1 was basically encapsulating like the creation. And then between verse 1 and verse 2, when it says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, that according to how you can interpret one particular Hebrew word in the original Hebrew text of verse 2, that the way that you can interpret this particular Hebrew word, it will word verse 2 in the way of basically saying that the earth had become that way. It had become dark, without form and void. Not that it had been created that way initially in the original creation, but that it had become without form and void, pertaining to or providing a interpretive pathway to presuppose that the earth had already been here and that there was a former catastrophe that took place that rendered the earth without form and void and dark. That basically there was water over the face of the deep because there had been a catastrophe that wiped out something that was here before. Gap theorists contend, therefore, that between verse 1 and verse 2, there is a span of the original creation versus recreation. And it's, spans thousands or millions of years. Now, again, I'm not supporting the gap theory, just like I do not in any way, shape, or form teach or believe that the Bereshith Genesis 6-day creation narrative was the actual original creation. I don't believe that either. I do not teach that. I don't go by that. For my own reasons, that would be another video in itself. It will go very, very long, very in-depth, and very detailed. But I'm also not a gap theorist because I've looked into the gap theory and personally, because of how I believe and what, from all the study I've done, scriptural, both canonical and extra-biblical, deuterocanonical, I cannot personally support the gap theory, because in a lot of ways I think the gap theory actually opens up very similar questions in the same way that just the original Bereshith Genesis creation narrative does. So again, we might go into this at some point, but the reason I brought this up anyway, the only reason I brought this up was because people that don't understand the Hebrew, they'll read through the Bereshith Genesis creation narrative for chapter 1 on, and immediately you're going to see discrepancies regardless. You're going to see things that doesn't make sense. Like, again, if Father is just creating in Bereshith and Genesis, and from day 2, day 3, day 4 on, if the planet was already here, then obviously people are going to think, well, then this can't be the original creation for the earth if the earth was already here, and now he's just bringing form to it. So this isn't creation. You're going to notice those discrepancies. No different than when you go into the latter part of verse 1 and you see that on the sixth day that Father made Adam. He made man, which Adam is literally taken from original Hebrew word Adama, which translates to meaning ground and also human. Adam is really just a straightforward Hebrew word which just refers to man. It's a general word for man. But anybody's also going to say, I've heard this from a lot of people, on the sixth day in verse 1 or chapter 1, on the sixth day he made man, male and female, he created them, told them to go out, fill the world, be fruitful, multiply. And then in chapter 2 he creates Adam, the singular man, from the garden, puts him in the garden, gives him a very different directive. People are immediately going to notice the discrepancies of that, and no matter what language that they're reading. But you're not going to understand the theological issues. You're not going to understand just how much there could be for you to learn, just how differently those things are going to read and be conveyed if you don't understand the original language. If you don't understand the Hebrew, you're not going to understand anything about why that there are these so-called discrepancies. You're not going to understand anything about the potential historical realities of the world that most people get completely wrong. You're not going to have any idea how to properly navigate or translate these things or understand history in the proper way if you don't run the scriptures by the original languages and understand what the original source languages were trying to convey. So why am I telling you guys this? Because it is very important that if you're going to read the scriptures, you're going to read the Bible, you have to run it by the original languages. And especially with certain verses, certain paragraphs, certain chapters, certain places, more than any other, man, it is so important to understand the Hebrew, to understand the Greek. And if you have a good lexicon, I mean, you can do that. It'll literally, a lexicon will literally break down which words that these words in English, for instance, were translated from. And it'll tell you what this particular word could be translated into in Hebrew. It could be translated into a variety of different things. So if you really want to understand the specifics and the deep nature of your faith, your doctrine, your theology, which for so many people, they're just completely backwards on. They're horribly confused. If you don't look into those original languages, you are going to spend most of your time incredibly distorted, to put it nicely. So it's very important. Source languages, very important. You need to start looking into it. You need to, if you're going to read the scriptures. Very important.